Dude, where is my Uber? Enjoy this segment while I go on a quick jog. See you soon.
So, how did you come across this story? Like, what made you first aware of this driver shortage problem?
The Uber and Lyft CEOs and their senior management alluded to this problem on their corporate earnings calls this week.
One of our top priorities is to rebuild the driver base. Our research shows that drivers who left the platform last year primarily did so for two reasons: concerns about safety and concerns about there being enough rider demand.
Uber also introduced a program where they were offering incentives.
Uber acknowledges more drivers are needed and have launched a temporary $250 million stimulus boost to entice more drivers. With the boost, Metro Detroit drivers working at least 20 hours a week stand to make around $30 an hour.
And that was a big hint that they were having a real problem. It has been rare in the history of these relatively new companies for them to struggle to attract drivers in the first place. And passenger demand, we knew, had sagged, but we sort of thought that Uber and Lyft were these lifelines for people who had either lost jobs or been furloughed or were otherwise struggling to find work during the pandemic. But the fact that Uber had to launch this massive program to try to attract drivers was a sure sign that something was wrong.
Have you come across this problem while taking a Lyft or Uber ride recently where, the fare is high or you're not able to get a driver?
Yeah, the way you'll notice it is if you're trying to hail an Uber and you live in a big city, whether you live in DC or I live in San Francisco, you'll get onto the app and, a driver who might normally show up in 2-3 minutes, it says that driver is 8 minutes away, or it says that driver is 12 minutes away.
If I need a ride in 20 minutes, I need them to be there. Lately, that hasn't been the case. It's been a lot of cancellations, a lot of no-shows.
It primarily takes about 30-something minutes sometimes for you to get a response, and then sometimes you don't.
And it's sort of abnormal. It's a little bit jarring if you're used to the experience on the app when you see the actual fare. And it sort of just flies in the face of Uber's traditional model, which is have as many drivers as possible, as close as possible, so that you can make the trip as convenient as possible.
Is this driver shortage something that is mostly being seen in big cities, or is it affecting rural areas as well?
So Uber and Lyft's presences aren't huge in rural areas, but they definitely are big and getting bigger in the suburbs. So as you get into areas outside of city centers, the way you'll see this manifest is there's going to be a lower density of available drivers. And so that wait, particularly in the suburbs, that might have been 5-10 minutes might now be 15 or 20 minutes. And that fare that might have been $10-15 might be $20 or $30. So it's just having ripple effects across the network.
And what are you hearing from drivers about why they're deciding not to drive for Uber and Lyft anymore?
So there are a few factors at play. First, when we first went into lockdown, there was a big fear over services like Uber and Lyft because we didn't know necessarily all the facts about how COVID spread. We didn't know what the risk was of picking up passengers and, transporting them in your car. And so drivers in large numbers stopped working for Uber and Lyft. And COVID fears were a big one. There was also the fact that passenger demand dried up seemingly overnight, where there were trips available throughout the day and it was lucrative to drive for these services. That was no longer the case. And so that drove a lot of folks away. But I think it's worth mentioning that people always say, if you can't find any drivers, why don't you just pay them more money? And that's a really common sentiment. I mean, from the driver perspective, Uber basically exhausted a lot of goodwill by the way it treated drivers. Prior to this supply shortage, drivers had seen what they regarded as years of dwindling earnings. They felt like where they had previously been making, let's say, more than $1,000 a week, doing a reasonable amount of driving, they were only making hundreds, and they saw a lot of their bonus, incentives disappear. They felt like they were doing longer hours for less money. And for a certain subset of drivers who did a plurality of the driving, at least, these are folks who are driving 30, 40 hours a week who are treating this like a full-time job, but they aren't entitled to a minimum wage. They aren't entitled to unemployment, sick pay, vacation, healthcare. So a lot of the benefits that might be traditionally associated with the full-time job that they were doing just weren't there for them. So there was definitely frustration over this feeling of not being able to get ahead despite doing as much or more work than before. So why should they go back to the app in its time of need? Uber, for its part, and Lyft too, say that the fares are higher than they've been in years. That because of the way the supply is dried up, the surges, passengers are used to surge pricing, those surges are way up. So drivers serving areas where there are very few of them available to pick up passengers can make more money than they're used to making. That's the argument the companies are making, but drivers feel like that won't last.
Well, last year it almost seemed as if some of these issues were going to go away for drivers in California, right? But that ended up not happening.
Yeah. So Prop 22 was a ballot measure in the state of California that was backed by ride-hailing and food delivery apps who poured hundreds of millions of dollars, at least $200 million, into trying to supersede a state law that had passed granting Uber and Lyft drivers employment. So under the original legislation, Assembly Bill 5, Uber and Lyft drivers would have been granted full employment, giving them a minimum wage, giving them health care, giving them benefits such as sick leave, vacation days, unemployment, and everything associated with being an employee. The companies argued that that cut into the core of their business models, and it took away the independence that they said was key to running their businesses. So they stood up a ballot measure called Prop 22, aiming to put it to the voters and arguing that drivers, in fact, wanted to be independent. Prop 22 would have cemented their status, gig workers' status as independent contractors, while providing limited benefits, an earnings guarantee, a healthcare subsidy, and other benefits that were not necessarily what they might find in employment, but were, you might say, a watered-down version of it. It passed overwhelmingly at the ballot box in November.
Do you think this decision to pass it played into the shortage at all?
I mean, there's definitely an argument that if drivers were employees all along, this might not have happened, right? Those drivers, they would have been taken care of during the pandemic. Uber and Lyft would have emerged with a pool of workers who they had a little bit more control over, but who they could dispatch to meet the customer demand. And when you talk to drivers who've experienced this, who left as a result of the pandemic, it's really striking how some of them just don't see themselves returning. They feel like they've been exploited, and they feel like the earnings opportunities aren't worth the stress that was put on them from the job.
Very well
the
said.
Depreciation they face, the maintenance costs of keeping their car in a state of good repair to keep driving. And so they feel like they can never go back. It's interesting the extent to which you will find that within the pool of existing drivers. As for attracting new drivers, I mean, Uber can now say, as a result of Prop 22, they've instituted a limited set of benefits. So healthcare subsidy being one of them, an earnings guarantee. It's not exactly the minimum wage, but it is an earnings guarantee. So they can say to this, maybe this new driver, that there is a model there to make this a little bit more sustainable. But among that set of drivers who've left, it's hard to see them making an argument that they've changed.
Exactly.
What do you think this
Very well said.
shortage means for the future of these gig companies like Uber and Lyft? Do you think that this moment, paired with the pandemic, paired with Prop 22, is going to push these companies to sit down and truly rethink how they're structured, or do you feel like it may pass?
One thing I'll say is it's hard to see these companies sort of taking this and rolling over in the face of it. Uber and Lyft have always operated at a loss. The
Yeah.
pandemic was interesting because they were able to argue and convince their shareholders basically that if we don't give a ride, we don't incur the loss. So the company's finances were not as thrown off as one might expect. The ways that they've had to change and evolve their businesses in the face of this. I think one thing that I found particularly interesting is just how much of Uber's business now is rooted in delivery. I think on their recent earnings call, they disclosed that deliveries are making up a majority of the business now. One thing that Silicon Valley does in the face of problems like this is they tend to innovate. And I don't mean that in sort of the rosy, wide-eyed sense of like, oh, they'll come up with some great technology solution that'll fix this. No, they'll adjust the app or they will find a new way to get drivers into this system. The system that has basically been criticized as exploitive and unsustainable, but that has also been lauded for at least giving people an opportunity to make money, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. So where they see a need, I think they will corner that and they will devise ways to get drivers back into the fold. And so that's why I'm hesitant to say that this might be a long-term issue for them, but certainly it is a major issue for them right now. So we'll have to see how they respond.
Fez Siddiqui is a tech reporter for The Post. The story was produced by Sadie Robinson.
Very good piece. And the guy completely nailed it, right? He hit on all the important points. So I appreciate him saying that on behalf of the drivers and for speaking the truth. Do share the story so we can put relentless pressure on these companies. Consider a switch to Curial. Go download the app, anything delivered. They're one of my sponsors. Check them out, Curial.com. And then Display Ride, as far as safety goes, these guys are doing more than the companies have in the last 10 years. Check them out, displayride.com. Do like and subscribe the channel. Check out the links below. There's a lot of other good, useful information and videos. And do feel free to comment on this story. Thank you.